Good evening. Glad that you have chosen to come out and join us this evening as we dig into the story of Gideon. It has to have a computer to actually get to. There we go. All right. So we find in Judges chapter 6, where James just read for us a few minutes ago, we find that Israel is oppressed, they're at a low point in their life, and they call out to God, which is kind of a pattern that we see in their life. And so God reaches out, and he decides that he would help them. So we come to the story of Gideon, starting about the middle of Judges chapter 6, and then it goes through chapter 8 of the book of Judges. And we're going to go through this evening. We're talking about Gideon, and on the way, we're going to talk about some questions that we might ask ourselves about our lives, the way we go through, and some of the things that we can learn. And then at the end, we'll spend some time talking about some of the lessons that we can learn from Gideon. One of the first things that we see in Judges chapter 6 is we see the call of Gideon. You know, after Israel pleads out, God reaches out and sends an angel to the land of, right there. Anyway, it sends a angel of the Lord to Gideon. So we're going to look at Judges chapter 6. We'll start at verse 11. We'll read to 11 to 16. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under a terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizarite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor.' And Gideon said to him, 'O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites.' Then the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?' So he said to him, 'O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house.' And the Lord said to him, 'Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man.'" So we see the call of Gideon. We see the angel of the Lord in Ophrah. You know, I looked down a second ago and couldn't find it. I was like, I know where this was, and I knew it was in there. So in this area, he goes and he calls Gideon. And he says, "Gideon, you will defeat the Midianites." So, and Gideon is a little bit reluctant. He's not your typical leader. He's not your typical military guy. He says, "I am the weakest in my father's house, and we're the smallest in the clan of Manasseh." So there's not a great strength that we see in Gideon. There's not a great lineage of warriors, and there's not a great drive here for him to lead the people. But God says to him, "It is in your hands that I will deliver you from the Midianites." And so then Gideon turns to the Lord and says, basically, "Can I have a sign?" So the first time we see with Gideon starts in verse 17 and goes down through verse 27. So we'll pick up our reading again in verse 17. "So then he, the angel of the Lord, said, 'If I have found favor in your sight,'" actually the Gideon said to the angel of the Lord, "and now if I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring you my offering and set it before you.' And he said, 'I will wait till you come back.' So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and the unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot. And he brought them out under the terebinth tree, and he presented it to him. Then the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, lay them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of his staff, and it was in his hand that he touched the meat and the unleavened bread. And fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that this was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Then the Lord said to him, peace be with you, and do not fear. You shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So we see Gideon's first sign. And as that meat was consumed, in verse 22 it says, Gideon was convinced. Gideon was at that point assured that this truly is the Lord, and this has come to pass, and this is kind of the path that he was going down. And as he sat there, you had to imagine, what did he feel was in his hand? Because it says, for I will defeat the Midianites with you as one man. So then after that, you see he got some more instructions. Look with me at verse 28. Verse 28 says, and the men of the city arose early in the morning. There was an altar of Baal torn down. No, we skipped. We're going to start in verse 25. Now it came to pass in the same night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull and the second bull of 7 years old, tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of this rock, in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and the burnt offering and sacrifice with wood of the image of which you shall cut down. So Gideon took the men from among the servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much, he didn't do it by day, but he did it by night. And then when the men of the city arose early the next morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image was beside it. It was cut down. The second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who has done this thing? And we had inquired, they said it was Gideon, son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your young son that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal, because he has cut down the wooden image beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. Therefore, on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against himself, because he has torn down his altar. So we see this courageous act was done. So Gideon went out as he was instructed and torn down this altar that had been placed among Israel. This altar that they had been worshiping instead of worshiping God. So he goes and tears it down, but he was afraid of his father's household and the men of the city. And we can see why, because when they rise in the morning, they were angry at what had been done. And they wanted to bring Gideon out and kill him for doing it. And so this courageous act that Gideon did, he did it at night. And he did it when no one was with him. So the question I have for us is, what do we do in life, even though it scares us? Because we see in this that Gideon had the desire to do what was right, but he was afraid. So he did it a little bit different. He didn't do it in the daytime. He did it in the evening time. So what in our lives do we come up against that we do, but maybe we don't do it quite as boldly as we should? Because before that, Gideon was told by the angel of the Lord, you surely shall not die. You will be fine, and I'm going to defeat the Midianites by your hand. But he went and did this, even though He went and did this at nighttime, even though he had this confidence. So what do we do? What do we do in life that we may not do it with all of our minds? We may not do it with all of the confidence because there's something in the back of our mind lingering that says, this is the right thing to do, but I'm afraid of other things that may happen. Persecution, consequences, making people angry, having people see me do this. What are some of those things that we may do? All right, so then Gideon asked for another sign. So he does all this, tears this down, and this goes well, and he survives it, and God's pleased with it. So the Midianites had been moving in, and so they're across the valley. And so they're starting to bring the armies near. And so Gideon asked for another sign. But we're not going to read all of this. But as the Midianites and Amalekites approach the army, their armies are camped across the valley. And Gideon sees them, and he knows that he's going to go fight them. So he asks for this sign, and because his faith in this mission is wavering. And we see this a few times in Gideon. So we have this whole proof by fleece scenario. So Gideon says, okay, God, if this is truly you, if I'm really supposed to do this, then give me a sign. And so the sign is simply, I'm going to put this piece of fleece out, and then in the morning, if the dew is on the fleece but not on the ground, then I will know it's you. Pretty simple. Fair enough. Well then, God does, what is that? Says, okay, Gideon, you want dew on the fleece and not on the ground. I put so much dew on this fleece, it says that he picked it up and he wrung out a bowl of water. Now, I always pictured this fleece just like just like some cotton ball style stuff. That's really what I pictured. And so you pick up this cotton ball and you just wring it out and you just see water continually coming out of it, more and more and more and more. Okay, so this has got to be it. Well, then Gideon says, okay, God, don't be mad at me, but let's go to part 2 of this. So proof by fleece part 2. He said, okay, I get it. This is you, but just so I'm sure, let's do this. Now make the fleece dry and the ground wet. The dew's on the ground, but nothing on the fleece. Night goes by. Okay, so God does it again. Puts the dew on the ground, but not on the fleece. So then by that time, there's no doubt in Gideon's mind. He says, okay, we've got this. It is truly a sign. The angel of the Lord told me I was going to do this. Then he told me I won't die. I went and tore down the altar of Baal, built the altar to the Lord, sacrificed. The sacrifice before where the rock consumed the meat and the fleece, I am 100% convinced. So now, we're good. All right, so question. When do we ever look at times in our lives that God gives us instructions and we question them? How often do we question God? And do we approach it the same way Gideon did? Okay, God, don't be mad at me. We're praying for stuff and we see maybe it's starting to come to fruition or it's going the way we ask. And we're like, okay, don't be mad at me, but I still have some questions. I'm still not completely confident that this is what's going on. So we reach out to God and we look at and we question things. Because in our natural lives, our minds tend to wonder and want things to be done a certain way. But we question God. All right, so after that, so we flip over to chapter 7 in the book of Judges. Now we have valiant Gideon leading Israel to war. So he gathers this massive army and says, okay, we're ready to go. So he goes in, he gets all these people, and it winds up being about 32,000 men to go to war against the Midianites and Amalekites. Now, it says that their number, was vast. And their camels were vast, almost like the sands on the seashore. And so they get this great big army, and God has other plans. God goes to Gideon and says, all right, Gideon, too many people. Because I don't want you to think this was done by your hands. I don't want you to think that this great army that you amassed is the one that gets the glory. So, we're going to let everybody that's scared go home. So Gideon goes to the army, says, all right, anybody that is afraid. If you're afraid, if you don't want to do this, if you would rather go home, you can go home. 22,000 people go home. 10,000 people stay. That's a bunch. And so you have to imagine how intimidating this scene is. So you have 22,000 people that are willing to go to war, but when it comes down to the brass tacks, and they have the opportunity to turn and go home, they're like, you know what? I'll just go. You guys fight, I'll go. But then God said, that's still more than we need. So now, let's do this. Let's get rid of some more. So then they go through the drinking test. All right. Gideon, take all these guys down to the water. And those that bend down and drink out of the water get to go home. Those that lap it up in their hands get to stay. So then God rolls it down to 300 people. Which group would you have been in? You're just going down to the stream. How would you drink out of the stream? I asked myself this question. Would you just bend down and drink it right out of the water that's running by, or would you lap it up into your hand? I decided I'd lap it up my hand. I wouldn't try and bend my face down in the water. So it looks like I would have been part of the 300 that stayed. So God says 300. That's enough. So I need 300 people and Gideon to go against this valiant Midianite army. So then they set out on this great quest. How would you feel? So you're Gideon, you're hesitant, you're reluctant, you're not what is you think of as the right leader, but God tells you you're going to do this. So you go and you get these signs, and you get this army, feeling pretty confident, and God sends most of your people home. 99% of the people went home. 1% of the people stayed. So out of one out of every 100, you got to keep before you go to war. And so now God said, okay, I'm going to give the Midianites into your hand. So Gideon's feeling great about this, right? Not so much. If we look in verse 10 of chapter 7, Gideon's still not sure. So God tells Gideon, if you're unsure still, take Purah and go down to the camp, and I will give you another sign. So Purah leads Gideon down to the camp, and the enemy was great and numerous, and he sees them, and they're massive. This is a massive army and a lot of camels, and there's a big challenge ahead of them. But he says, okay, I'm going to get the final proof that I need. So Purah leads him down to the camp, see in chapter 7, and then the dream of the barley loaves. He hears these two soldiers. He gets down where he can hear them, and the one soldier turns to the other soldier and said, I had this weird dream last night that this loaf of barley rolled into our camp. And it rolled over and it hit a tent, and the tent fell over and fell upside down. And the other was like, oh no, that is obviously the sword of Gideon, and we're all going to die. Now, could you imagine? I'd like to hear the rest of the story. I would think there had to be more conversation about this. Like the guy going, dude, it was a loaf of bread. It was a bundle of barley. It was not, there was nothing about a sword. There was nothing about death. It was a tent that fell over. But this interpretation of this dream in verse 13 gave Gideon everything that he needed. We look at verse 15 and says, and so it was when Gideon heard the telling of this dream and its interpretation, he worshipped and returned to camp and said, arise, for the Lord has delivered Midian into your sight. So this dream of the barley loaf was the obvious sign that he needed. This dream and the interpretation gave him everything that he needed to be confident that the Lord was going to do what he told him was going to do back in the beginning. So question. What odd interpretation or conclusion have you came up with in your life? Through a dream, through an interaction, through a conversation? What are some things that you became convinced of that may be unusual, maybe different, maybe the Holy Spirit gives you a thought based upon something that you've seen, something you've read, something that you've learned that helps you to see something a little bit different than you've seen it before. Maybe it's a confidence. Maybe it's a curiosity. Maybe it's a thought that says, maybe I should connect to a certain person. Because Gideon saw something, got a confidence out of something that was extremely random. That dream had really very little connection to proving what he was thinking, proving the battle that he was in. So we look at towards the end of chapter 7. Then we have this unconventional strategy. So after Gideon worshiped God, he went back, awoke his army, and said, okay, arise, we're going to do this thing. The 300 of us are going to go take out this massive army of the Midianites. So he says we're going to divide into 3 groups. 3 groups of 100, and we're going to split up. The instructions were given to them. Basically, Gideon says, I want you to watch me and follow me and do as I do, because the Lord has given us into our hands. So they had this great weaponry that consisted of a pitcher, a torch, and a trumpet. So they grab their pitcher and their torch and their trumpet, and they go off to war against a great army. And it's interesting, we see God's unconventional ways of battle. And this is just another one that we see in the history of Israel. This is not conventional warfare. So then they approach, and they execute God's plan. So they break pitchers, hoist torches, blow trumpets, and shout, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. Now that was a great battle plan. We can see how it would work. But what it did is it showed God that they followed God's plan. They didn't go in their own might. They didn't go after a certain strategy. They did exactly as God instructed. So then what happened was God turned the Midianite army against itself. And in that scenario, they had army person kill an army person, and basically the great army imploded upon itself and wound up eliminating itself in the end. So what unconventional activities and success have you seen inside God's people and inside the Lord's church? Because God works in mysterious ways. And in our own lives, there's things that happen in our lives that are unexplainable. Have you ever sat down and talked to someone and they talked about an encounter that was just out of the blue? It was not normal, was not typical. And you think, man, that had to be providential. Or you look back on an event in your life and think, there's so much. I can now see the providence of God working in my own life. Just like we can see the providence of God all the way from the moment where the angel of the Lord approached Gideon, all the way through to the defeating of this army. We can see the providence of God in it. And we can see the reward and the success of following God's way. You know, they didn't have this massive army plan. It doesn't even say they had one sword among the group. They had no weapons. They had a pitcher, a torch, and a trumpet. Think of the Midianite army. If they saw them. So you come with pitchers and torches and trumpets. 300 of them. And they start with 32,000. And I can just imagine, since the Midianite army was talked about being as numerous as it was, that there was more of them than there was even starting out with Gideon's army. But they got whittled down to 300. And we see a little bit later in the chapter, all 300 of these men survived. All 300 of these men, there was none of them that were lost. In this, God preserved every single one of them. So then after this, we see victory and peace. Gideon and his army of 300 had some final cleanup to do. In the rest of chapter 7 and first part of chapter 8, they go and they pursue people, and they wind up doing some of the cleanup work, eliminating the final part of the Midianite army. We see Gideon is approached by his countrymen that were mad at him. They said, "Why did you do it this way? Why didn't you add us? Why didn't you include us?" You know, but when Gideon went through and explained it to them, they were fine. They understood why he did it the way he did. And then the people said, "Gideon, we want you to be our ruler. We want you to rule over us. We want you to lead us." And Gideon refused. He said, "I will not be your leader, but let God be your leader. Let God lead you and let God direct you. I do not want to be the person that leads you." And then Israel was at peace for 40 years throughout the life of Gideon. So Gideon went on after this war to lead a life that was peaceful for 40 years. Now, they gathered all these earrings and made this ephod, and I don't feel that they ever got all of the idolatry out of their camp. They still allowed some of that idolatry to still exist. I mean, they weren't pure in serving God, but they were at peace. They said Gideon died at a good old age with many wives and children. They said Gideon had 70 sons. Gideon had 70 sons. One of them was named Abimelech, which goes on in Judges chapter 7 to talk about Abimelech and his 3-year terrible reign from that. So what can we learn from Gideon? What can we learn from what lessons can we learn in the simple story? Sometimes God can build strong leaders. God doesn't have to have strong people to be strong leaders. God can take normal people, everyday people, average people, and can build strong leaders from them. Also, sometimes God sees more in us than we do. God saw so much more in Gideon. And we approached him. Gideon's like, "Who am I? I'm the smallest of my youngest house, and we're the smallest in the tribe of Manasseh. I can't do this. I cannot do this." But God saw something in Gideon that he did not see in himself. Also, we see that one person can make a difference. One person in Gideon and his service to God and his questions and all the events that he went through made a huge difference. It led to a period of peace, led to a defeating of a great army. After Israel pleaded at the end of chapter 6, "Lord, help us, deliver us," and he did. And then they wound up going right back. The vicious cycle that they got into. The other thing that we see is sometimes there's things in life that make us afraid. Sometimes there's things in life that scare us. But we need to move ahead. We need to do that next thing. Gideon, in all of these challenges, always accepted the answer and always took the next step. He never once did he flee. Never once do we read about him turning away he always asked, accepted the answer, and moved forward. And that's a great lesson that we can learn. And finally, that we see that God can do amazing things in strange ways. God's wisdom is not the same as ours, and God's way God accomplishes things sometimes is in ways that we don't understand. But we do see in the lesson in the story of Gideon that a great thing was accomplished by one simple man and a lot of strange ways. God doesn't have to have the normal ways to get things done. So we see that. So hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully you can see that Gideon went from a young man that had fear in his life, and he was afraid to start, to where he led people to a place of peace. But we'll find no better peace than we'll find in Jesus. And we see throughout Israel their plea for help, and then their redemption, and then their deliverance, and they turn right back to that same way that they left. And in Jesus, we find a way that he says, come unto me. He says, I will help you. I will lead you. I will lead you to an eternal home, and I'll give you a great life on the way. But all we have to do is take that initial step and say, Lord, I trust you. I want to give my life to you. I'm ready to step forward. I'm ready to confess you. I'm ready to be buried in baptism with you. I'm ready to rise and walk as a new creature. And he gives us that opportunity. Not only now, but every moment of every day. God invites us to come. And as children of his, if we find ourselves like Israel in that cycle of trying to do better and falling back, and trying to do better and falling back, and I want better. I want better. You can see it in the history of Israel. They wanted the blessings of God, but they kept letting their lives get in the way. God has a remedy for that too. It's his people. And we can help you on your walk no matter where you are, whether we can walk with you, whether we can pick you up, whether we can pray with you, or baptize you into that initial step of obedience. It's very simple. All you do is just come, and we'll help you if we can. If we help you in any way, please come as we stand and as we sing.